May 4, 1982, South Atlantic Ocean, east of the Falkland Islands. The Type 42 destroyer HMS Sheffield steams on radar picket duty, scanning the horizon for Argentine aircraft. At 09:55 local time, the ship's air search radar detects two Super Étendard strike fighters at 35 miles range, too far away to pose immediate threat. Sheffield's Sea Dart surface-to-air missiles can engage at 40 miles, providing comfortable defensive margin. The crew maintains alert, but doesn't classify the contact as urgent. What HMS Sheffield's radar operators don't know is that at 25 miles range, one of the Argentine aircraft has already launched an Exocet anti-ship missile. The French-built weapon, flying at 15 feet above the waves, accelerates to 680 miles per hour. Its active radar seeker acquires Sheffield at 8 miles. The missile climbs to 8 feet, levels, and impacts Sheffield's starboard side at 10:04. The 364-pound warhead doesn't detonate immediately, but unburned rocket propellant ignites fires that consume the ship's interior. Sheffield burns for 4 days before sinking while under tow. Soviet naval observers monitoring the Falklands War reach an uncomfortable conclusion. Western anti-ship missiles are significantly more lethal than Soviet intelligence assessments had predicted. The Exocet that destroyed Sheffield is comparable to the American AGM-84 Harpoon missile, subsonic, sea-skimming, active radar homing. Soviet doctrine had dismissed such weapons as tactical threats, limited by short-range and small warheads. The destruction of a modern British destroyer by a single missile from an aircraft that never approached gun-range forces reassessment. For the Soviet Navy, anti-ship warfare doctrine in the 1970s centered on overwhelming firepower delivered at close range. Soviet surface combatants were designed to survive penetration to gun range or short-range missile launch distances, then destroy enemy vessels through volume of fire. The AS-4 Kitchen missile, launched from Tu-22M backfire bombers, could engage targets at 250 miles, but the missile was massive, required bomber delivery, and the bombers were vulnerable to carrier-based fighters. Ship-launched systems like the SSN-7 Starbright, deployed on Charlie-class submarines, offered 35-mile range, adequate for surprise attacks, but requiring submarines to approach dangerously close to well-defended carrier battle groups. Soviet naval planners calculated that American surface combatants would need to close to 20-30 miles to launch effective attacks. This assumption was based on World War II experience, when naval engagements occurred at visual range or slightly beyond, decided by gun accuracy and armor thickness. Even accounting for missiles, Soviet intelligence believed that Western anti-ship weapons had limited range and required continuous guidance from launching platforms. The doctrine assumed that Soviet ships, accepting casualties during approach, could close range and destroy American vessels through concentrated salvo fire. Reports of the Harpoon missile's capabilities throughout the 1970s were dismissed as Western propaganda or exaggerated specifications. Soviet analysts questioned whether a subsonic missile with a relatively small warhead could reliably sink modern warships. The physics seemed questionable. How could a 488-pound warhead guarantee a kill against vessels displacing thousands of tons? The range claims of 60 miles or more suggested either propaganda or weapons that sacrificed guidance accuracy for range. Soviet doctrine emphasized that accurate terminal guidance required launch platform involvement, which limited practical engagement ranges regardless of missile propulsion range. By the late 1970s, Soviet confidence in surface fleet capabilities was growing. The Kirov-class nuclear-powered cruisers displaced over 25,000 tons and carried extensive anti-ship and anti-aircraft armament. Sovremeny-class destroyers provided high-speed surface action capability. Kiev-class aircraft carriers, though smaller than American supercarriers, gave Soviet naval aviation limited power projection. The Soviet surface fleet was expanding and modernizing, equipped with weapons Soviet planners believed could compete with Western navies on favorable terms. What Soviet naval intelligence didn't fully appreciate was that American engineers had solved the fundamental problems of long-range anti-ship warfare through guidance technology rather than raw missile performance. The AGM-84 Harpoon, developed by McDonnell Douglas in the early 1970s, became operational in 1977. The missile's design philosophy differed fundamentally from Soviet anti-ship weapons. Rather than emphasizing speed and warhead size, the Harpoon optimized guidance reliability, range, and launch platform flexibility. The result was a weapon that could be deployed from destroyers, cruisers, frigates, patrol boats, submarines, and maritime patrol aircraft, providing American forces with universal anti-ship capability across virtually every platform. The missile measured 12.5 feet long with a wingspan of 3 feet when wings deployed. Total weight was approximately 1,500 pounds, with a 488-pound penetrating warhead. Large enough to cripple or sink most surface combatants, but small enough that aircraft could carry multiple missiles. The turbojet engine propelled the weapon at 488 miles per hour, subsonic by design. Speed wasn't the priority. Guidance accuracy was. Blockwire Harpoon missiles, the initial production version, achieved 60-mile range. Later, Block IC variants extended range to over 120 miles through improved fuel management and propulsion efficiency. Modern Block 2+ missiles, introduced in the 2000s, integrate GPS guidance with active radar homing and achieve ranges exceeding 150 miles. The progression demonstrated continuous improvement in capability without requiring complete weapon redesign. The revolutionary element was active radar homing. Unlike Soviet missiles that required the launching platform to illuminate targets with targeting radar throughout the missile's flight, the Harpoon carried its own radar seeker. After launch, the missile flew a pre-programmed course to the target area using inertial guidance. Upon approaching the estimated target location, the seeker activated and searched for radar returns matching ship characteristics. Once a target was acquired, the missile guided independently to impact. The launching ship could turn away, launch countermeasures, or engage other targets immediately after firing. The fire and forget capability fundamentally changed naval tactics. Sea-skimming flight profile provided additional survivability. After launch and initial climb, the Harpoon descended to 2 to 15 feet above the ocean surface. This altitude placed the missile below the radar horizon for most ship-based radars until the final seconds before impact. Defensive systems designed to engage aircraft at thousands of feet altitude struggled to track and engage missiles flying barely above wavetops. The combination of low altitude and small radar cross-section made Harpoon detection difficult even for ships with advanced radar systems. Launch platforms varied widely. Surface ships mounted Harpoon missiles in enclosed canisters, typically 4 or 8 per installation. The canisters protected the missiles from weather while maintaining launch readiness. P3. Orion maritime patrol aircraft could carry 4 to 8 Harpoons under wing hardpoints, giving land-based aircraft the ability to engage surface targets hundreds of miles from shore. Submarines received capsule-launched variants that could be fired from standard 21-inch torpedo tubes, surfacing after water exit and igniting rocket motors. This flexibility meant that Soviet surface combatants faced potential Harpoon attack from virtually any direction and from platforms they might not detect until after missile launch. The cost was reasonable by military standards, approximately $1.2 million per missile in 1980s dollars. This made Harpoon economically viable for mass production and widespread deployment. American destroyers and frigates routinely carried 8 Harpoon missiles, providing significant anti-ship capability without requiring massive investment in individual platforms. The tactical implications were revolutionary. A Perry-class frigate displacing 4,000 tons armed with Harpoon missiles could engage and sink a Kirov-class cruiser displacing 25,000 tons from 60 miles away, well outside the range of the cruiser's gun armament and matching or exceeding the range of Soviet anti-ship missiles. The smaller vessel could shoot first, potentially achieving kills before the larger ship could respond. Naval warfare had fundamentally shifted from platforms optimized for close-range slugging matches to platforms optimized for standoff precision strikes. Testing throughout the 1970s and early 1980s validated the Harpoon's performance. Live-fire exercises against decommissioned target vessels demonstrated 90+% hit rates under realistic conditions. NATO exercises simulated engagements where Harpoon-equipped frigates successfully sank ships, simulating Soviet surface combatants at ranges exceeding 50 miles. The weapon's reliability exceeded expectations, with few failures during test programs. The Falklands War in 1982 provided indirect validation. While British ships lacked Harpoon missiles, they relied on different weapons, including the Exocet's sister system. The war demonstrated the lethality of modern anti-ship missiles. The Sheffield's destruction by a single Exocet missile proved that subsonic sea-skimming missiles with moderate warheads could destroy modern warships. The sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano by British submarine-launched torpedoes demonstrated that surface combatants remained vulnerable to underwater attack. The lessons were clear. Standoff precision weapons had become the dominant factor in naval surface warfare. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s provided additional evidence. Both sides employed anti-ship missiles against commercial and military vessels in the Persian Gulf, creating the tanker war that threatened international shipping. American naval forces deployed to protect neutral shipping found themselves facing Iranian naval vessels, including frigates and patrol boats armed with Chinese-supplied anti-ship missiles. The confrontation would demonstrate Harpoon's combat capabilities under operational conditions. Operation Praying Mantis, conducted on April 18, 1988, validated every claim made about Harpoon missile performance. The operation began as retaliation for Iranian mining of international waters, which had damaged the frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts. American forces targeted 2 Iranian oil platforms, used as military observation posts, and engaged Iranian naval vessels that attempted to intervene. The frigate USS Simpson detected the Iranian frigate Sahand at approximately 60 miles range. Simpson launched Harpoon missiles at near maximum range. The missiles flew sea-skimming profiles to the target area, activated their radar seekers, acquired Sahand, and guided to impact. Multiple hits set the Iranian vessel ablaze. Fires spread through the ship's interior, ignited ammunition and fuel, and Sahand sank within hours. The entire engagement occurred at ranges where Sahand's weapons couldn't respond. The Iranian frigate was destroyed before it could fire a shot in defense. The patrol boat Joshan attempted to engage American surface combatants and was destroyed by a combination of Harpoon missiles and gunfire. The frigate Sabalan suffered severe damage from Harpoon hits and barely survived. Within hours, American forces had destroyed or crippled half of Iran's operational navy, demonstrating the overwhelming advantage of long-range precision anti-ship missiles against forces lacking equivalent capability. The precision impressed even American commanders. In one engagement, Harpoon missiles struck intended targets within a convoy of multiple vessels, avoiding collateral damage to non-combatants. The active radar seekers distinguish between ships based on size and radar return characteristics, guiding to the designated military target rather than striking nearby commercial vessels. This precision, combined with standoff range, made Harpoon ideal for operations in contested waters where minimizing unintended casualties was politically essential. Soviet naval observers analyzing Operation Praying Mantis recognized immediately that American Harpoon missiles exceeded Soviet equivalents in practical combat effectiveness. While Soviet missiles like the SSN-22 Sunburn were faster, achieving speeds over Mach 2, they were less accurate and required more complex fire control solutions. The Sunburn's speed advantage was offset by guidance limitations and the fact that faster missiles were easier to track with radar, providing defenders more warning despite shorter reaction times. The range disparity between Harpoon and Soviet ship-launched anti-ship missiles created an asymmetric advantage. Harpoon's 60-mile block. I range, extending to 120-plus miles with Block IC, exceeded the 35-mile range of the SSN-7 Starbright and matched or exceeded most Soviet ship-launch systems. This meant American destroyers and frigates could engage Soviet surface combatants before Soviet ships could launch effective counterattacks. The ability to shoot first in naval combat provided decisive advantage. The ship that launches first can maneuver defensively while its missiles are in flight, potentially evading return fire that might never be launched if the first salvo achieves kills. Soviet anti-ship missiles suffered from fundamental design compromises. Emphasis on speed and large warheads resulted in physically large missiles that required substantial launch infrastructure. The SSN-3 Shadok, deployed on cruisers and submarines, was over 30 feet long and weighed over 10,000 pounds, requiring massive launchers that consumed deck space and weight margins. These large missiles achieved impressive range, but their size limited how many could be carried, and their guidance systems required external targeting data from reconnaissance aircraft or radar platforms, creating coordination requirements that complicated operations. Soviet command guidance systems required launch platforms to maintain radar illumination of targets throughout missile flight. This meant Soviet ships launching anti-ship missiles had to continue tracking and illuminating targets for minutes after launch, exposing themselves to counter-battery fire and limiting their ability to maneuver defensively. The Harpoon's fire-and-forget capability allowed American ships to launch, then immediately take evasive action or engage additional targets, providing tactical flexibility Soviet systems lacked. The sea-skimming flight profile defeated Soviet radar systems optimized for high-altitude threats. Soviet air defense radars and fire control systems were designed to engage aircraft and missiles at medium to high altitudes. The combination of powerful radars and long-range surface-to-air missiles created formidable defenses against conventional air attacks. However, low-altitude sea-skimming missiles presented entirely different tracking challenges. The radar horizon, the distance at which ship-based radars can detect low-flying objects, is approximately 25 miles for a missile flying at 15 feet altitude, detected by a radar mounted 100 feet above water. This meant Harpoon missiles approaching at 60 miles would be undetectable for the first 35 miles of flight, providing only seconds of warning before impact. Soviet naval doctrine emphasized salvo attacks, launching multiple missiles simultaneously to overwhelm defensive systems. The assumption was that American ships would fire one missile per target, perhaps two for critical targets, allowing Soviet ships to absorb some losses while enough vessels survived to deliver their own salvo. Harpoon's reliability negated this calculation. With hit rates exceeding 90% in testing, American ships could realistically expect single missiles to achieve kills. This meant a frigate with 8 Harpoons could potentially engage 8 different targets or guarantee destruction of 4 targets with 2 missile salvos. Soviet planners had calculated based on much lower hit probabilities, assuming multiple missiles would be required per target. Soviet attempts to develop Harpoon equivalents illustrated the technology gap. The SSN-25 Switchblade, introduced in the late 1980s and early 1990s, incorporated active radar homing and sea-skimming flight profiles similar to Harpoon. However, the weapon didn't enter widespread service until the 1990s, a decade after Harpoon had become standard throughout the US Navy and Allied fleets. The deployment lag meant Soviet surface combatants spent the critical 1980s period lacking effective countermeasures to American long-range anti-ship missiles. The legacy of the Harpoon program extends far beyond the Cold War. Over 7,500 missiles have been produced since 1977, with continuous upgrades maintaining relevance across technological generations. More than 30 nations operate Harpoon missiles, making it one of the most widely deployed anti-ship weapons in history. The weapon remains in active service as of 2025, with Block 2+ variants incorporating GPS-aided navigation, improved seekers, and extended range exceeding 150 miles. The combat record validates the design philosophy. During Operation Praying Mantis, every Harpoon missile fired achieved hits or near misses that caused mission kills. Subsequent operations in the Persian Gulf maintained this performance standard. The reliability, accuracy, and effectiveness demonstrated in combat conditions confirmed that the fire-and-forget anti-ship missile concept was not just theoretically sound, but operationally dominant. Soviet and Russian naval development eventually produced missiles comparable to Harpoon in some respects. The Club missile family, introduced in the 1990s and 2000s, includes variants with active radar homing and ranges exceeding 120 miles. The Caliber cruise missile system, which gained prominence during Russian operations in Syria, incorporates similar guidance principles. However, these systems entered service decades after Harpoon, and the technology gap that defined the 1980s has never been completely closed. Russian surface combatants still rely heavily on large, fast missiles optimized for salvo attacks, rather than the single-shot reliability that Harpoon emphasized. The doctrinal shift caused by Harpoon and similar weapons fundamentally changed naval warfare. Surface engagements that previously occurred at gun range, less than 15 miles, often much closer, now take place at distances where ships never achieve visual contact. Gun armament, once the primary weapon of surface combatants, became secondary to missile systems. Modern destroyer and frigate designs emphasize missile capacity, fire control systems, and defensive capabilities rather than gun batteries. The surface warfare mission changed from closing range to engage to maintaining standoff distance while engaging with precision missiles. The validation that smaller ships could threaten larger vessels through standoff precision strikes influenced ship design worldwide. Navies that couldn't afford large cruisers or battleships discovered that frigates and corvettes armed with modern anti-ship missiles could contest sea control against much larger opponents. This democratization of naval firepower reduced the importance of platform size and emphasized weapons systems and sensors. A 4,000-ton frigate with 8 harpoons became as significant a threat as a 10,000-ton cruiser in many engagement scenarios. The economic implications were substantial. Building and operating large surface combatants is expensive. Harpoon demonstrated that relatively inexpensive missiles deployed on modest platforms could achieve effects previously requiring capital ships. This realization influenced naval procurement worldwide, with many nations opting for larger numbers of smaller missile-armed vessels rather than fewer large traditional warships. The Persian Gulf operations during the 1980s and early 1990s established patterns that would define naval operations in contested littoral waters for decades. Precision anti-ship missiles allowed naval forces to control sea lanes while minimizing risk to high-value assets. The ability to engage threats at standoff ranges, combined with accurate targeting that avoided collateral damage, made naval power projection more politically acceptable and operationally sustainable. The Soviet Navy had designed its surface fleet for engagements that would be decided at gun range or through close-range missile exchanges. Ships were built with heavy armor, multiple redundant systems, and weapons optimized for surviving penetration to short range where overwhelming firepower could be brought to bear. The doctrine assumed that Soviet vessels would accept casualties during approach, but would destroy American ships once range closed. Training emphasized aggressive tactics, rapid damage control, and coordinated salvo attacks that would saturate enemy defenses. The Harpoon missile made these assumptions obsolete. American destroyers and frigates didn't need to close to gun range. They could launch precision strikes at 60 miles, well beyond the effective range of Soviet ship-launched anti-ship missiles. The active radar homing eliminated the need for continuous guidance, allowing American ships to fire and maneuver defensively immediately. The sea-skimming flight profile defeated radar systems optimized for high-altitude threats. The reliability meant single missiles could achieve kills that Soviet doctrine assumed would require multiple hits. Soviet surface combatants designed for combat at 35 miles or less faced American vessels that could sink them from twice that distance. The gap wasn't just 30 miles of ocean separating the fleets. It was fire-and-forget technology that allowed American ships to shoot first, shoot accurately, and sail away before Soviet vessels could close to effective range. The mathematics were unforgiving. In an engagement where one side can shoot from 60 miles and the other must close to 35 miles, the side with longer range can deliver multiple salvos before the opponent enters firing range. The Soviet Navy recognized this disparity, but lacked the industrial capability to rapidly close the gap. Developing active radar seekers with sufficient reliability for fire-and-forget operations required advances in miniaturized electronics, signal processing, and guidance algorithms. Soviet electronics industry lagged Western equivalents by generations in these critical technologies. Even when Soviet engineers understood the principles, Implementing them at the scale and reliability required for operational weapons proved difficult. The Harpoon missile, operational in 1977, represented American innovation in guidance technology and tactical doctrine. Soviet attempts to develop equivalent systems produced weapons that entered service in the 1990s, a gap of 15 years or more. During that critical period, American naval forces possessed systematic advantages in surface warfare that Soviet surface combatants couldn't counter. The ability to engage and sink enemy vessels from standoff ranges while remaining immune to counterattack redefined naval combat. Soviet naval doctrine was designed for the War of 1945, close-range gun duels and torpedo attacks, where courage, training, and numerical advantage determined outcomes. The Harpoon brought precision missile warfare of the 1980s to surface combat. The transformation wasn't incremental improvement in existing weapons. It was a categorical shift in engagement ranges and guidance reliability that made traditional surface warfare doctrine obsolete. Soviet ships armed for 35-mile combat faced American destroyers that could sink them from 60 miles. The gap was fire-and-forget technology that let American ships shoot first, shoot accurately, and sail away.